You want to know the real reason why the Orange Man wants this big, beautiful bill to pass so quickly? There are provisions in there that are not just cutting Medicaid, cutting SNAP, cutting benefits. In fact, there are provisions in there that would effectively make any sort of opposition to the president null and void. For example, one provision is that federal courts will no longer be able to hold the president in contempt. That was something they added in there very recently. I wonder why. You see, for all of you who kept saying the man is defying court orders, he's defying judges, that was never the case. Notice how these people don't answer questions when they're being asked in front of Congress, or they don't take their rhetoric in front of an actual judge. Because there are consequences, there are still rules, there are still guardrails in place to stop these people. But because they have essentially lost every single case that has gone in front of a federal judge, they have had an injunction filed against just about every executive order that they've tried to put out. They are now trying to add a provision that basically says the courts can't do anything anymore. We are done losing in the courts. We're just going to remove them altogether. These are the things that really upset me. These are the reasons why it is very concerning to watch Republicans chanting USA, USA when this bill passes the House of Representatives. These people are chanting to have their own power taken away from them. How the hell did we get here? How did we really get here where an entire party has decided we don't want democracy anymore? We don't want there to be any sort of rule of law or due process. We don't want those things anymore. What we want is control, and we want all of that control to be in the hands of the orange turd. That is concerning. That is very concerning for the future of this country. This bill cannot get through the Senate. It absolutely cannot get through the Senate and make it to that man's desk, because that big, beautiful bill is the death certificate of America.
I couldn't care less if he's upset. I'm concerned about my children, my grandchildren, and the fact that we are stealing from them. We are stealing from our children and grandchildren. $37 trillion in debt, and we're going to add to it as Republicans? That is unacceptable. And that's why there's no way I'm going to vote for this bill in its current form.
You've got to hear this. Trump voter and Trump supporter Chamath Palihapitiya just came out in a huge way against the Republican Trump-backed spending bill.
The level of financial illiteracy in this bill will come back to bite America in the ass. This is a bad bill as constructed. And if it passes, forget what any of us think, the bond markets will act decisively, and they're going to go in one direction, and it's away from us.
I want to share with you the secrets of this disastrous budget bill, like Donald Trump ordering the MAGA Republicans in Congress to try to put a provision in this budget bill that says that a federal court is not allowed to hold anybody in contempt of court, criminal or civil contempt, under the federal rules of civil procedure. Now, Donald Trump realizes that his unconstitutional, unlawful, and behavior that otherwise violates court orders is putting him and his regime down a path where they are likely going to be held in criminal contempt soon. We saw, for example, yesterday in Massachusetts, a federal judge, Judge Murphy, found that the Trump regime violated a preliminary injunction when the Trump regime sent a Burmese man to South Sudan. We're seeing what's happening with the Abrego Garcia proceedings, where there's a discovery procedure taking place before Judge Zinnes in the federal court in Massachusetts. But I think that case is heading to a situation where Trump is going to be held in criminal contempt. You look at the various cases taking place in Texas, in Colorado, frankly, throughout the United States. The walls are closing in on the Trump regime as federal courts are about to issue, I would say in the next 90 days or so, I think criminal contempt against Trump regime people. So here you have the MAGA Republicans trying to put provisions in the budget bill that would say that not just Donald Trump, I guess anybody, the way this is written, can't be held in contempt. It takes away Article 3 powers, which, by the way, is completely unconstitutional. But take a look. Section 70303, restriction of funds. Here's what it says. No court of the United States may use appropriated funds to enforce a contempt citation for failure to comply with an injunction or temporary restraining order if no security was given when the injunction or order was issued pursuant to Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 65C, whether issued prior to, on, or subsequent to the date of enactment of this section. So not only would this apply future cases, but it would apply retroactively as well to the various cases involving Donald Trump.
Why did you sneak this thing into the budget bill about the courts? To give the current administration unlimited power. Didn't we already make this video? Nope, you're thinking about the Supreme Court case around national injunctions. We wanted to hedge our bets, so we did something worse. You're saying that the administration can ignore court rulings and the court effectively can't do anything about it? Yeah. I'm clearly misunderstanding this because that's insane. No, I will happily explain it to you because it's very clever. Oh, I'm gonna hate this, aren't I? You know all those executive orders that the courts were saying were unconstitutional? Ending birthright citizenship, deporting people to prisons in El Salvador. If the administration were to ignore those rulings now, they'd be in contempt, and judges would have a series of things that they could do to try to get the administration to comply. But this bill says that specifically for these national injunctions, courts can't use their already approved budgets to do any of those things. So basically you're just like cutting off the payroll, like you can't pay clerks to do paperwork, you can't pay U.S. Marshals to go apprehend people. Exactly. We have neutered the courts through the budget. House Republicans already passed this? Yeah, but it gets worse. Oh, come on. This is specifically for cases where a bond wasn't issued at ruling. What does that mean? This is a oversimplification, but sometimes judges will say, hey, even though I'm ruling in your favor, and this is unconstitutional, you still have to give me a big pile of money to hold on to for a while, just in case this gets turned over. Me? I have to give them money? Yeah, in case your lawsuit causes any damages. So basically this makes it impossible for everyday people to take on cases like this, but it gets worse. But just spit it out. It also applies retroactively. So you're saying that all the cases that they lost already to federal judges and circuit courts, they can just ignore those? This applies to every case. The Muslim ban from the first term, the mifepristone protection from 2023, every federal case. Holy shit. So this is worse than the SCOTUS case in some ways. Yeah, and it gets less good. Just say all the bad things now. Do you understand how appeals work? Yeah, if you lose a case, you appeal it to a higher level court and you hope that they overturn the lower level court's ruling. And if national injunctions can't be enforced, the only way to get a national ruling against what we're doing is to get it to the Supreme Court. Shut the fuck up. If the administration loses a case and they're told it's unconstitutional, normally they would want to appeal it to the Supreme Court to get it overturned. Yep. But now they don't want SCOTUS to hear it because they can just ignore the national injunction as long as SCOTUS doesn't issue a national ruling. I told you, it is genius. Do you have an erection? Oh, I'm surprised you can see it.
Yes, I know it's not very ceremonious. I'll just I guess there's no lead burying, really. The media isn't talking about this. I'm not sure why, probably because they hate you. Also, there's no way to cover it without sounding really, really alarmist. There are a few articles, but you're not going to see widespread discussion, which is interesting because it's probably the single most dangerous thing in the entire big, beautiful bill. They added a provision, very sneaky, last-second provision to the big, beautiful bill. Now, remember how the Trump administration has petitioned to the Supreme Court the argument that federal injunctions shouldn't be allowed? Remember that? Now, remember how in the arguments of that case and in cases that followed, where the Supreme Court, validated pre-existing federal injunctions, it seems very likely that when the Supreme Court makes a ruling on that, in probably late June, I think, it seems likely that they are not going to grant the request of the Trump administration. They're not going to They're not going to make federal injunctions not a thing. In case you don't know, a federal injunction is how a federal judge keeps the government from doing something that is illegal. If a law is passed and somebody sues the government and says, "Ayo, this law violates our constitutional rights," a judge takes that case and then can issue a federal injunction to stop the government from doing that thing. The Trump administration has tried to get the Supreme Court to rule against federal injunctions. It's probably not going to. So this is their next attempt. Basically, they're trying to make federal injunctions impossible in the form of a budget provision. And what this essentially means is that pre-allocated budget funds that are handed out to federal judges and the courts in general, of course, they all receive money from the federal government, they're federal judges, they're federal courts, they cannot use that money to pursue contempt charges alongside, or if federal injunctions are not followed. Essentially, what this means is that if the government violates somebody's constitutional rights, very, very blatantly, like it could be a cop or ICE arrests a citizen and deports them to Sudan, and that's that, right? And they say, we're going to do that to all black people. They just say that, right? Well, normally a federal injunction would put a stop to it. But now, if a federal injunction is issued against that behavior, the judge, all judges, would not be able to allocate any resources to hold the government in contempt for not following the injunction. After all, the consequences of not following the injunction are to, you're held in contempt, which is a crime, and then the government can go after you, right? The judge can file up paperwork with the clerks. The judge can send marshals after you. But all of that takes money. And what this provision in this bill does essentially is say, nope. The money that is allocated via the pre-existing budget, which is all the money that you have, cannot be used in the furtherance of pursuing contempt charges if an injunction is violated. What this effectively means is that there would be no way for the judiciary an injunction is violated. What this effectively means is that there would be no way for the judiciary to ever meaningfully enforce federal injunctions. It would erase the judiciary with regard to their ability to stop the government. What's more, and this is a particularly nefarious bit because it does get worse, believe it or not, the language in the House-passed bill would block federal judges from enforcing their contempt citations if they had not previously ordered a bond, a provision Republicans said was intended to discourage frivolous lawsuits by requiring a financial stake from those suing. Meaning that even if the judges could somehow get funding to pursue contempt charges against people violating their federal injunction, they would not be allowed to do so unless the plaintiff in the case, the one who was suing the government, was issued a bond and put up money, potentially an enormous amount of money, because the purpose of the bond is restitution in case it turns out the federal injunction is unnecessary. So it's possible that in order for the government, the judiciary, to be able to do anything about a violation of the law from the federal government, you would have to pony up hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe, possibly more than single-digit millions, because the bond would need to be proportional to the potential harm of a revoked injunction. So only rich people can sue at all? Essentially, yes. And even the rich people who sue, if there is a federal injunction issued on their behalf, nothing can be done about it because the judge cannot allocate any resources in the pursuit of contempt charges. The government can do whatever they want. This bill essentially ends the judiciary. That's not an exaggeration. That's what it does. Like this in impact, it's essentially the Enabling Act. Yeah. This is it. But will the bill pass? It's already passed the House. It was in the big, beautiful bill. It's essentially the Enabling Act. It completely nulls any judicial action against the government for any unconstitutional behavior. And you might be wondering, what happens if a case makes it to the Supreme Court? Because the Supreme Court doesn't issue federal injunctions. The Supreme Court makes rulings. Their power is above, right? Well, here's the thing. Cases only make it to the Supreme Court if they're appealed from lower courts. Usually. Right? Like, normally what would happen would be somebody, either the government or a plaintiff, would lose the case in a federal court, it would get appealed, and the Supreme Court would choose whether or not to take the appeal. The Supreme Court would be the only institution left capable of stopping the federal government. So what happens if cases never make it to the Supreme Court? Like, let's say, for example, the federal government does something unconstitutional, right? Blatant violation of one's constitutional rights, and they're sued for it. And a federal judge says, yep, government's violating the law. We are issuing a national injunction. The federal government says, oh no, and then keeps doing that thing anyway, because there's no way to hold them in contempt. Funds can't be allocated for it. How would that ever make it to the Supreme Court? After all,
they are pacing this almost perfectly, so that way that people don't feel like that what is happening is happening. Here's what I mean by that. It was never going to be some big collection event, right? There was never going to be a single day where hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people all got picked up off the streets and out of their homes and sent to detention facilities. That was never going to happen. They have to do it in these piecemeal points where it's hundreds of people across the entire United States a day, or thousands of people across the entire United States a day get removed. Why do they have to do that? Because it creates a sense then that as more and more people get lifted off the streets, people who are left don't feel in their eyes like the number of people who are on the streets in their day-to-day life changes. So they don't put it together, right? I think you should remember this phrase, right? You're not going to feel as though there are people missing until you are missing people. You know what I'm saying? And that is the perfect psychological position for the people doing this to have placed us in. I don't know if you guys have remembered, but Mahmoud Khalil, I'm sorry, he still got sentenced. Like, he was a green card holder who practiced his First Amendment rights, and he was picked up by ICE and deported. I'm pretty sure he was deported all the way. Like, you know, the Rubicon has been crossed. Like, whether or not you're crossing it with them, it's been crossed, okay? And, like, there's no restitution for it currently. There's just waiting. There's just waiting, it seems. And that is horrifying.
Has anyone else noticed how the tension in this country seems to be escalating? The racial tension seems to be increasing the closer we get to this big, beautiful bill becoming a law. I want to make sure people take stock in that, okay? I want to make sure people pay attention to what is happening right in front of our faces. As Republicans, as the wealthy class get closer and closer to getting a bill passed that guts every resource for the working class citizen, it is no surprise that we see all of these scary incidents taking place right in front of us, specifically with law enforcement. Police officers being given immunity. The DOJ saying they will not look into any civil rights cases when it comes to law enforcement across the country. These things are not happening by accident. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I just look at patterns of behavior. As we watch the wealthy class engage in what will be the second largest upward transfer of wealth and resources into their pockets, taking away more things from the working class, taking away Medicaid, SNAP, taking away things people need to survive, it should not surprise you that the uptick in racial tension is happening at the same time, because the goal is to ultimately piss people off so much. And as usual, make them look at minorities, disabled people, trans people, make their voters look at people who don't look like them as the problem so they can take money right from out of their pocket. It's the same playbook. They don't change their methods. All they do is switch up a few names. They rebrand a few things. They bring up different talking points at certain times, but they never change their game. If you are still sitting at home thinking that there is going to be some sort of windfall coming your way, if you voted for this man and you think that at some point he is going to have your back and it's all going to work out in the end, we just need to be patient and see how things work out. He is going to come through for the people who voted for him. I'm telling you right now, you're not going to get that. And when it's all said and done, if they get everything they truly want from running the government the way that they're running it, you are not going to be in any better of a situation than the people you hate In fact, you might be in a worse situation than the people you have been hating all of this time. You gotta wake up at some time. You have to know your savior is not coming. The orange man is not coming to help you at all. So this video is not a video telling you to change your vote. This video is one saying that you need to start getting angry at the people you voted for, because that supposed mandate that you wanted or you were told was coming your way, you're not going to see it. And then you'll get more upset at people who don't look like you when they haven't done anything to make life so difficult for American citizens. So think about that.
Everything that is happening right now has to happen. They have to be in charge of everything from the Senate to the House of Representatives to the presidency. And they have to implement all of these white supremacist policies to the fullest extent. They have to. So that people who still believe in patriarchy, who still believe as long as it's a man doing it, it must be the better thing. As long as it is a white person doing it, it must be a better thing. They need to see all of these policies cost them, and cost them dearly. They have to see that racism is really expensive. They have to see that sexism is really expensive, and that it doesn't get you anything, because quiet as it's kept, DEI or whatever you want to call it, any policy that is good for black people has always been good for everyone. Universal health care is better for everyone. Universal child care is better for everyone. It's never just implemented for black people. And you can't say that, and it cannot come out of a black mouth. You have to see what the alternative is. And we're going to be living in that alternative very soon.
The House just passed the Felon-in-Chief's budget with its deep cuts to social service programs, including Medicaid, Medicare, and SNAP, as well as increasing the budget of the Defense Department, as well as solidifying into law the tax cuts that he gave out to the rich in 2017, and it includes additional tax cuts for the wealthy. It was recently reported that the 10 richest Americans, including Jeff Bezos, a couple of the Walton brothers, Warren Buffett, just last year alone, their wealth increased by $385 billion. That's not including the increases in wealth that they saw since the pandemic. All of this is to signify that their plan seems to be working. And this goes beyond Project 2025, you all. Now, Project 2025's agenda is bad enough, but even worse still, behind it is the agenda of the mega wealthy. A couple of months ago, I released a video that went viral. It was of an interview with a gentleman named Douglas Rushkoff. He is a scholar who studies technology and how it is affecting our lives. And in that interview, he talked about how he was invited to go speak at a conference about technology. That's what he was told. So he went to where this conference supposedly was, and it was this super exclusive, sequestered resort. And he was ushered in and met with these 5 billionaires. And these billionaires asked him questions about when society collapses, how can we preserve our wealth and our standard of living? How can we maintain the loyalty of our staff and our armed private security? And Rushkoff responded with, well, why don't you use your vast resources to help improve life all over the globe, and you won't have to worry about the fall of human civilization? They scoffed at him. And Rushkoff coined the term the billionaire mindset for how warped these people think. Consider this. Muskrat spent $44 billion to buy Twitter. $44 billion. And he did it so that he could create his own personal echo chamber of racist, white supremacist, white nationalist ideologies. They do not care about anybody else who is not them. And what they are doing right now with the Cheeto in chief as proxy is they are continuing to fleece the rest of us dry. And they believe that they can sequester themselves away for when society eventually collapses, either due to an extinction level event, like an environmental crisis that ironically many of their businesses are mainly responsible for after decades of poor environmental business practices, or social unrest, or a combination of all of the above. They are buying up huge swaths of land all over the globe. They are building and constructing compounds underground and enclaves that they believe they can retreat to when society collapses. And then when the dust settles, they can reemerge, their wealth intact, and remake society in their image. Or they can go off planet and escape Earth altogether and colonize the moon and Mars. That's the true motivation behind all of that rhetoric and that talk. Here's the thing, though. In their arrogance, they believe that they are invincible because of all of the enormous wealth that they control, but they're not. Look at, again, what's going on with Muskrat and his crumbling empire, chiefly Tesla. What we need to realize is that we need to be aware of what they are doing. We need to use our vote and vote in every local, state, and national election, starting with the 2026 midterms. And then we need to move in one accord with our dollars, like how the Black community is doing right now. Look at Target. And again, look at Muskrat. They are not inevitable. Their plans are not etched in stone. And we just need to remember that.
It's something that has to happen. It's something that has to happen. It's something that had to happen. It's something that will happen. And it's going to happen, no matter what. No matter whether it's Trump or anyone else. Anyone who says, for example, well, that's what you get for voting for Trump, or you should have voted for Harris. Well, I mean, you're so thoroughly indoctrinated and participating in the deception and the deflection of that system that you yourself are just as much a cause for the collapse of the United States as anyone else that you blame for it. You created a class of national elites, oligarchical elites, whose private profit interests are no longer connected to your own economy. You did that. They're not connected to any productive activity. They're not connected to any nationality. They're not connected to your standard of living, not to your stability, not to your safety, your prosperity, your success as a nation, or anything. And that class of private sector powers became essentially a nation unto themselves, like I've said many times. A nation that transcends borders. It transcends national interests. They don't have any interests except their own interests. You created that, and you celebrated that, in fact. You still celebrate it, never realizing that they would inevitably sacrifice you for their own profit interests, the same way that they've sacrificed millions of people outside your country. You created this psychopathic class of predators. And you expected them to never bite the hand that feeds them, even though the hand that feeds them has always been feeding them hands. Now they can't tell the difference between the food and the feeder anymore. It's all just flesh to them. You can't raise a wolf on human flesh and expect him to distinguish between the human you are feeding him from the human who is feeding him. Eventually, he doesn't see you as his master or his owner anymore. He only sees you as food. Well, you raised a wolf on the flesh of the global south, and it turns out you taste just the same. Yes, wolves don't care if it's dark meat or light meat. They'll chew you up either way. Look, for decades, the military-industrial complex, the MIC, in America, it was a towering giant in America, in the U.S. It was the driver of the economy. They shaped policies at home and abroad. But today, there's a decline in its dominance, and that's been coming for a while. It's no longer the sole engine of the American economy. It's no longer the most important engine of the economy or the global economy. Now, this change wasn't due to any great moral awakening or some newfound sense of conscience. No, it's the result of systemic shifts within the American economy, popular fatigue over endless wars, corruption and fraud within the military-industrial complex, and of course the rise of the A-National OCGFC. The U.S. economy has diversified. I mean, decades ago, in the 50s, say, weapons and military technology was central for America's economic growth. But today, other industries, technology, finance, obviously healthcare and so on, it surpasses that. And of course, globalization shifted the focus from building tanks and jets to dominating digital platforms, international markets, and so on. Then came the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was the big shift when the Soviet Union collapsed. You know, then the supposed existential threat that justified the immense military budgets and spending and so on, that disappeared. That threat disappeared. I mean, you tried to come up with new threats, terrorism, war on drugs, what have you, but none of these threats really could justify the scale of investment that was needed to keep the military-industrial complex, you know, influential. And like I said, the public became tired of wars in the 2000s. Iraq, Afghanistan, it drained the American public, emotionally, financially, politically, and people began to question the wisdom of pouring trillions and trillions of dollars into conflicts that only ever resulted in spreading chaos and destruction. Not to mention, you have rampant fraud and corruption in the military-industrial complex. You have overcharging, you have magically disappearing funds, you know, that were handed over to defense contractors. They've misplaced enough money. The military-industrial complex, defense contractors, have misplaced enough money to house every homeless person in America and educate every child. They charge so much for one weapon that China could probably build a dozen for the same price. I mean, if the military-industrial complex has been the vehicle that carried the American economy, well, it sure isn't a fuel-efficient vehicle. It's a gas guzzler. And of course, you can barely get anyone anymore in America, young people, what have you, who are willing to put on a uniform and fight for this money laundering scam. That's all it is. That's all it is at this point. I mean, you want to send your sons and your daughters to go die in a foreign country for Raytheon? That's what they're doing. They're not fighting for democracy. They're fighting for General Dynamics. Well, nobody wants to do that. How are you going to convince anyone that they're fighting for democracy 6,000 miles away from their own crumbling neighborhood in New York, and their neighborhood is crumbling because all of their tax money is going to Lockheed Martin? You can't convince people to fight for that. You can't. So then, because your pool of soldiers is shrinking, then you have to start changing your approach to killing and carnage. You have to start changing your means of destruction, because you can't really do traditional warfare anymore. You had to develop new technologies, which means that the demand for conventional weapon systems, which the military-industrial complex was based upon, that's given way to focus on drones and cyber capabilities and artificial intelligence and so on and so on and so on. So the MIC hasn't disappeared, but its form and its scale has changed. And part of that, too, is because America started moving manufacturing overseas, you know, globalization and so on. And in order for the military-industrial complex to really maintain its importance, well, domestic manufacturing was key. Domestic manufacturing was key. But pretty soon, more and more companies were keeping their toothbrushes and their shampoo in somebody else's house. And you know what that means. America went from being the wife of corporations to being the side chick. See, again, because you had to change how you go about killing people, you know, rather than learning how to get along with people, you had to come up with new technology, and that new technology depends upon electronics, which means rare earths. Well, we're talking about private corporations, talking about profit-driven corporations. So all they care about is money. All they care about is low-cost acquisition. And China flooded the market with cheap rare earths, which caused the market price to plummet. And that put rare earths mines out of business. You see how that works? Just like I was talking about with oil. So now China controls about 80% of the world's rare earths market and 90% of the processing. Think about that. The American military is completely dependent upon Chinese rare earths. You know, you talk about confronting China, but they can shut you down in 3 seconds if they want to. This is what I mean. You literally created this situation for yourselves, and it has nothing to do but play out now. It's inevitable course. It has to just play out. You gave private enterprise absolute autonomy, absolute supremacy, and that included sectors within the military-industrial complex. Your MIC-driven ideological obsession with the Soviets led you to engage with China, and then China opened up. And then you very quickly became dependent upon them. And they have surpassed you to a stunning degree in manufacturing and in technology. And now you can't even make a drone without China. You can't even make a drone. And you need drones because you don't have soldiers. You see? You've been doing nothing for decades now but cultivate your own demise. It's really quite poetic in a way. And in this whole process, like I said, you're rich, your companies, your elites are increasingly untethered from your national interests. And now they're floating above the stratosphere, you know, the stratosphere of global financialized capital, and they're looking down and they see America as just another landmass, just another population to be pillaged. And so as the MIC recedes, other factions have risen in prominence. At the forefront, of course, is big tech, which emerged from the military-industrial complex, companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, and so on. These aren't just businesses anymore. Those are oligarchical political powers. They dominate global markets. They shape cultures. They influence politics. They influence politics in ways that the MIC never could even have dreamt of. I mean, they control the flow of information. They control communication. They're gatekeepers of knowledge and power now. They're massive. And then there's, of course, financialization. This is very important. The financial sector not only shapes economic policy, but it exerts immense political influence as well. I mean, the 2008 financial crisis showed us that Wall Street's too big to fail. And since 2008, their grip has only expanded and tightened. I mean, even those tech giants, Google, Apple, and so on, a huge amount of their wealth is actually due to financialization, not sales, not ad revenues. It's through financialization. It's basically fake money. Then, of course, there's the healthcare and the pharmaceutical sectors. Big pharma, it's massive and obviously incredibly influential politically, as we all saw during COVID. Okay, these are all a-national, along with things like construction and mining and so on, you know, subcategories. And they're all corralled together. All of these diverse business interests, they're all corralled together in asset management firms like BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard. Those three companies constitute what you could call universal owners. They don't operate according to any one country's interests. They don't operate according to any one company's interests. They operate according to the combined interests of international economic sectors. They're the first C in the OCGFC, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital. They're the controllers on behalf of the owners of capital. And they have the reach, and they have the portfolios, and they have the power to coordinate and to orchestrate economic planning across the globe on behalf of the vast array of investors. They control literally trillions of dollars, and they're connected to sovereign wealth funds around the world that gives them influence and access to trillions more. They dwarf the military-industrial complex in this regard, particularly since the primary source of money for the military-industrial complex is the American government, which is extremely constraining for them. That's very limiting for them. Asset management companies, they don't have that restriction. So yes, this is the faction that Trump represents. And you'll see that all of his policies serve that faction. I've said this before. You have to look past all of the MAGA rhetoric, all of the nationalist rhetoric, because all of that is all just a camouflage for what will be the shrinkage of America on the global stage, and what will be the ransacking of the U.S. economy. It's like if a snake oil salesman was selling cyanide instead of snake oil. That's what Trump is doing. Like, for example, okay, I've already talked about how his energy policy, how that puts the U.S. on a path to energy bankruptcy, not self-sufficiency. And it will only strengthen OPEC, by the way. But also look at withdrawing from the WHO. Okay, American pharmaceutical companies and healthcare providers, insurance companies, and so on, they're expressing concern and disapproval for what he did, for pulling out of the WHO. But who benefits from that? The beneficiaries are going to be all of the so-called emerging economies, emerging markets, and their healthcare providers, their pharmaceutical companies, their insurers, and so forth. They're hindered right now by patent protections, by regulatory restrictions, and policies against, especially against generic drug production and so on. India and China, for example. This is very important for them. So this is actually the sidelining of America. And of course, the same is true, of course, obviously with tariffs. You know, basically everything that Trump proposes or promises or wants to do, all of it amounts to shutting America off from the world and directing everybody elsewhere, telling all business to go elsewhere. The only place he approaches with open hostility, from a policy point of view, the only place he approaches with any hostility is Europe and other Western countries, other allies. I mean, he might be serious about trying to take control of the Panama Canal. He might be serious about that. But I think that mostly has to do with just confirming that America is only going to be interested in having influence in the Western Hemisphere, in the global North. But I mean, even that, when you weigh the cost of maintenance of the Panama Canal, management, staff, security, and so forth, repairs, and on, everything that America would have to spend in order to control the Panama Canal, well, the net profit is barely going to be $1 billion annually. That's assuming that the trade flows through the Panama Canal remain as they are, which, given Trump's obsession with tariffs and his obsession with alienating global business from doing business with America, it seems likely that trade through the Panama Canal will actually decrease. So frankly, taking control of the Panama Canal will most likely end up costing America considerably more than they'll ever profit from it. It's the same with Greenland, really. I mean, given how disruptive and how alienating it would be for America to actually force Denmark to sell them Greenland, plus the amount of investment that they would have to put in, the initial cost and the investment and taking over services and so on inside of Greenland. Even with Greenland's natural resources, the U.S., I think, would be lucky to break even. I mean, that's if we take it seriously in the first place. Like I said, nothing Trump says should ever be taken at face value. He never means anything that he says. His public positions are always either bargaining tactics or just sheer misdirections. Both Panama and Greenland, and the idea of Canada becoming an American state, all of these are just moves, in my opinion, to try to estrange allies and isolate the U.S. as much as possible. That's what I think he's doing. And I think that that is the desired outcome. That's the real desired outcome, which is why I think it's a serious mistake to ever think that any politician's rhetoric about why a policy is being pursued is the actual reason the policy is being pursued, whether it's Trump or anyone else. It's not. This isn't unique to Trump, because you always have people saying that, like, even analysts, well, that policy didn't work out as planned. Wow, that really backfired, and so on, because the outcome was not the outcome that was outlined by the original rhetoric. No, the outcome was exactly as desired. The rhetoric was the lie. I've said that decentralization is going to be the theme of this era, but decentralization in the West is precipitated by demolition and by disintegration, while in the Muslim world and in the global South, it's going to be precipitated by building and by integration. It's very different. The distinction is critical. It's somewhat misleading, actually, to talk about decentralization in the West, or anyway, it would be easy to misunderstand or to overlook what that decentralization is really about, because decentralization in the West is literally about breaking down components of the existing power structure, components that compete with private sector authority. So it's actually a power consolidation move, ultimately, by the OCGFC, breaking down America as the global hegemon, and then breaking down the central authority of the federal government within the country, and then selectively breaking down the localized formal power structures at the state level, basically rendering public sector institutions as redundant to make way for private sector control. Eventually, this could even prompt, like I talked about before, secessionist movements, whether literally or functionally, by individual states inside the United States. Functionally, I think it's inevitable. It's inevitable functionally, as the federal government becomes less and less relevant in terms of governance. So you're going to have individual states in America acting more or less like independent states, independent entities, independent countries, and then some states will even be regional hegemons within the territorial United States. That's already the case, to be honest. I mean, California, Texas, New York, and so on. These are basically domestic hegemons within the United States. So it's not a huge leap to go from that to individual American states conducting their own foreign policy and so on, and really operating like independent countries. And of course, I anticipate something similar to that happening in Europe, as I've talked about many, many times. The EU, the European Union, will certainly dissolve within the next coming decades. Tension and conflict and so forth between countries is already spreading as we speak. In 20 years or so, No one's even going to be able to imagine that Brussels was ever the seat of continental power in Europe. But again, this disintegration will be and is being engineered for the purpose of consolidating private sector power. So yes, what we think of as the formal power structure, government and so on, this is going to be decentralized through disintegration. But the entirety of the West, America, the UK, and Europe, and so forth, are going to be brought under the domination of the A-national OCGFC, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital who are non-nationalistic. It's a stateless imperial power that as of right now actually does represent the only real global hegemon. As of right now, the OCGFC are the unipolar superpower in the world today. See, there's been a creeping capture of state power in the West by corporate power. That's something that a lot of people fail to notice, or to fully understand anyway. You know, throughout the colonization period, throughout the neo-colonization period of the global South, the West itself, the colonizing nations themselves were also being taken over. You know, it turns out that the pillagers who looted Africa, Central and South America, the Middle East and Asia and so forth, well, they just turned out to be serfs themselves. You know, it's like a bank robber being taken hostage. You come back from your crime spree in the global South only to find yourself being enslaved by your own accomplices. That's what's going on. So in a way, decentralization in the West isn't decentralization at all. It is consolidation. It's demoting every existing nationalistic power center and bringing them all under the totalistic overarching control of the OCGFC. But as I talked about last time, for the population, there will be, or there has to be, some sort of ground-up decentralization whereby communities build their own localized systems to take care of themselves. You know, and these systems could have the potential of actually breaking away from the corporate control system. In the West, decentralization is the aftermath of engineered collapse. It's reactive. It's the result of institutional erosion, civil fragmentation, and the withdrawal of legitimacy from governance. But in our context, in the Muslim world, in the global South, decentralization is proactive, it's strategic, it's regenerative. We are not decentralizing because our states are collapsing. No, we're decentralizing because we are reconstructing ourselves and our traditional ways of governance and relationships of power in our parts of the world. For us, this isn't about breaking the state apart. It's about freeing the state from subordination. So in the formerly colonized countries and neo-colonized countries, there's an element of decentralization in terms of detaching from Western centers of gravity, centers of control, you know, Washington, London, Paris, etc. That's within the global context, there's decentralization. Our countries are no longer going to be ruled or coerced or dominated or subjugated by Western nationalistic powers. America and Europe are going to move to the periphery of our considerations, whereas all we have known for centuries was for them to be at the center of our considerations. You know, everyone always had to think about what America or what the UK or what Europe wants, what they will do, what they will allow us to do, and so on. Alhamdulillah, those days are over. So that is a form of decentralization. A further form of decentralization will be the fact that we are not going to be orbiting around a single global hegemon, but rather we will, most of us, will be within the sphere of influence of multiple regional hegemons, and those spheres of influence will most likely overlap. In other words, more than one regional power is going to have a stake in this or that country and will have influence over this or that country. More than one state will have that. A perfect example of that would be Syria today. Of course, this is true of most of our countries to one degree or another already, but I think Syria is a good example. So there's not going to be, what multipolarity does not mean is a plethora of strong independent countries. The absence of Western domination will not mean the sudden emergence of a multitude of sovereign, self-sustaining, independent states. No. There will be regional hegemonic powers that share an interest in and an influence over the countries within their overlapping spheres of influence. That doesn't mean that all of those countries will just be complete vassal states. No, there will be degrees of independent governance, but they will exist more or less in an informal system of collective sovereignty. In other words, their sovereignty will be achieve through the synthesis of multiple coordinated cooperating powers who serve and protect their shared interests in those countries, the countries within their combined spheres of influence. So again, take Syria. Turkey has a stake, the GCC has a stake, even Russia has a stake, Iran has a stake. So Syria becomes a sort of protectorate under half a dozen more powerful countries, all of whom collaborate, coordinate, and cooperate in concert to try to stabilize and develop and secure and manage Syria. You know, the extent to which any particular country may already independently be strong or strategic or important, that will determine its own role within the sort of collective sovereignty structure and how much leverage they have vis-a-vis the other hegemonic regional powers, like Egypt, for instance. Egypt is an incredibly important and strong country. In certain areas, Egypt is a regional hegemon in its own right, in some areas, but not in others. But see, that's the genius of this sort of system. It's mutually reinforcing, it's mutually fortifying, because the same is actually true of most countries that we can call regional hegemons. The same thing is true. They all have their weaknesses, they all have their limitations, and they have their strengths. But collectively, acting in coordination rather than in competition, they can compensate for each other's shortcomings. So like the GCC can give power to Egypt, and Egypt can give power to the GCC. You know, the geopolitical fundamentals of Egypt, or say Turkey, are far better than the Gulf. But the Gulf has enormous financial power, energy resources, and they've built a remarkable degree of autonomy, a remarkable degree of political reach and connections, and a grid of influence, not only within the region, but around the world, including inside the West. You know, it's like BRICS. By creating a sort of unified portfolio, putting all of the resources and all of the strategic leverage that's possessed by each member of BRICS into one group, that group becomes basically the geopolitical BlackRock of the world. They control more resources, more assets than any existing or any imaginable group on Earth. They have the most important natural resources, the most important demographic features, the most strategic waterways and trade routes and ports, the biggest grouping of manufacturers, the biggest grouping of workers and consumers and investors on this planet. See, decentralization through building and integration, collective sovereignty. We decentralize not because we've given up on the state, but because we refuse to let our states be given up to foreign capture. Thus, we circle our wagons, and through multiple centers of power, we become a single power. So in a way, it's similar to how decentralization in the West is actually just a mechanism of power consolidation, but rather than dissolving state power, we connect states through synthesis of mutual interests and mutual or shared priorities and a common fundamental value system. And yes, to fortify and to strengthen us against a common enemy. Let me be clear, when I speak about decentralization in the Muslim world and in the global South, I am not at all advocating, and I should not be misunderstood as advocating, a dismemberment of national authority. I'm speaking about multipolar sovereignty. Nations acting together in concert, intertwined in their interests, committed to mutual reinforcement and shared economic protection of one another. But let me also say that this solidarity and this sovereignty can and should be manifest in many ways, also in decentralized ways. Again, from the ground up, through cross-border cooperation among people, among businesses, among economic sectors, through private initiatives and so forth. Because our governments shouldn't have to do all the work. They shouldn't have to do all the work themselves. This is a very difficult transition that everyone is going through. You have to understand what colonization and neocolonization really mean, what they have really meant for our countries. Colonization means captivity. That's what it means. The global economy has been centralized in the same way that a prison is centralized. And we've been the prisoners of that system for centuries. And we need to organize a prison break. That's what's going on. In a prison break, you need everyone to work together. Not only work together, but also be capable of working independently. Everyone has to do their job. You have to be able to rely on everyone to do their job. You can't negotiate your freedom from your jailer, so you have to tunnel out. And that needs diggers, that needs watchmen for that. You need your tools for that. You need a getaway car and so on. Everyone's got to do their job, and everyone has to be, you have to rely on everyone to do their job. So we're drawing a map of our escape plan. The global economy is not open and inclusive until now. most nations in the world are not truly in the global economy. They're inside the global economy the same way that a detainee is inside of a facility. They're embedded within the architecture, but not as participants, as captives. Their captivity is imposed through a structure of needs that they cannot meet without foreign permission, without foreign currency, without foreign capital, without meeting following foreign regulations. It's the illusion of participation. You know, being connected to the global system is not the same thing as being a participant in the global system. Access is not sovereignty. You know, it's like thinking that if the prison gives you access to certain privileges, it's the same thing as being free. No. Those are nothing but levers of control over you. That's why they give you those privileges. The ability to trade, the ability to borrow, to import and to export and so forth. These aren't signs of power or freedom. They're very often markers of dependency itself. Globalization has made captivity look like participation to a lot of people, but that's not what it is. I mean, take the price of fuel, say, in countries like Nigeria or Pakistan. It's not determined by their own production or by their own consumption. That's not what determines the price. The decisions are made in Washington, what the price is going to be. When the U.S. Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates, the economic consequences cascade across the global south. In Abuja and Karachi, they feel the tremors before the ink is even dry on the minutes of the Fed meeting. Central banks in their countries scramble to try to curb inflation, not in response to any local realities that cause that, but because of the whims of foreign capital. That's captivity. The same is true with food. You know, nations across North Africa and the Sahel import the majority of their food staples. Their ability to eat depends on container ships, depends on insurance premiums, and it depends on commodity exchanges that are located in cities that their populations will never visit. A disruption in the Red Sea, a bottleneck in the Bosphorus, a price spike in Chicago, in the Chicago future markets, makes them go hungry. Their sovereignty is replaced with dependence, and they call it development. Even national economic policies are not drafted for the people of the country itself, but for the approval of ratings agencies. You know, ratings agencies in New York or in London or what have you, to please Moody's or Fitch or to please the IMF. Governments are pressured into austerity measures, cutting public services, selling off what little remains of the commons. The right to borrow on international markets becomes just a noose, tightening with every downgrade, with every IMF negotiation, with every foreign investor's quarterly report. And if any country dares to try to break free from this arrangement, if it even attempts to define its own terms, well, the punishment is swift. Access is revoked, just like a prison revoking prisoners' privileges. Sanctions are imposed, isolation is enforced, just like being thrown into solitary confinement. Yeah, you've got solitary Zinzana cells in the global economy too. The message is clear. If you want to be a part of the global economy, if you want to engage with the global system, you can only do it on the terms of the West. So you can't even begin to talk about sovereignty of any kind as long as you are in any form of economic captivity. Economic sovereignty is the prerequisite for political independence. Economic captivity is the condition in which a state or a region or a people cannot meet its basic material needs, food, water, shelter, energy, health, so on and so on, without external systems granting access or enabling provision. Captivity is when you need permission to feed your own people, when you need debt to build your own infrastructure, when you need foreign investors to provide your people with jobs, you know, when you need foreign currency in order to buy anything, even from a neighboring country. Economic captivity is enforced by dependency on imports, dependency on capital flows, dependency on multilateral partners, on supply chains that you don't control, and financial rules that you don't write. That's captivity. And it's when you can be punished simply for trying to live outside of those rules. We don't gain freedom by asking for better conditions inside the prison. You understand? You don't achieve justice by negotiating with your captors for better rations or for longer chains. And that's what we've been doing. Economic captivity isn't accidental. It's engineered. It's not a failure of development. It's the intended outcome of the system that was built not for your development, but it was only built to undermine and to control you and to make sure that you didn't develop. The global economy has been utterly and completely corrupted and deformed by Western greed, by Western predation, and by parasitic pillage. They have never operated in the world, in fact, like they're even a part of the human family, let's be frank. They have operated in this world like some sort of alien predator that has just come down to drain the sweat, blood, and tears of the human race and to ransack the planet's resources. That's how they've acted. Like they have somewhere else to go when it's all been depleted. I mean, we have to be honest about this. We have to confront the fact that the West has operated with absolute malice, with absolute contempt for the whole world. Not today, not yesterday, but literally for centuries. And there is no remorse, there is no repentance, there's no rehabilitation. Literally, the only thing that has changed now, today, is that now their malice and their contempt has made them turn on their own nations. They haven't reformed, they're just repositioning. This is the only difference. There's no change in their character. The A National OCGFC are not our friends just because they're no longer constrained by nationalism. They're just as predatory and just as vicious as they ever were. They are transitioning out of necessity. You understand? And because of their own insatiable predation. That's what necessitated this transition. They're transitioning. Understand? They're not transforming. They're moving. They're not changing. Their nature is the same as it ever was. And if you take a wide angle view of how the world is shaping up, we're actually not talking about multipolarity. We're talking about two major powers, two hegemons, the OCGFC and the collective sovereignty of the Global South. If you want to put it even more simply, then we're talking about BlackRock and BRICS. Now, BlackRock and the A National OCGFC are working with BRICS, as we know. They're working with the emerging spheres of influence that are building collective sovereignty in the Global South. But don't ever mistake that for genuine partnership. You know, these are like scouting missions. They have to try to recalibrate and to adjust to the new terrain, the new economic and political landscape that's coming into existence by the transition. And they're only doing that to look for ways to try to bring it under their control. That's their whole mentality. They have the entirety of the West under their control now. I mean, literally, you can say that the world is going to be divided now between North and South. America is going to be the organizing instrument for managing up there under the umbrella of the OCGFC. Down here, we have to form a sort of conglomerate of spheres of influence that operates like a unified single hegemon. Do you understand me? You see what I'm saying? This is why our governments are going to need the people to participate in that. They need the help of the people. I mean, the people need to work together. They need to build together. They need to develop together as much as possible. We need to help our countries untether themselves from the West and from Western systems. And a lot of that has to do with the population. We all need to cooperate in this prison break, okay? So if you're going to bust out of prison, you need to know the layout. You need to know the blueprint. You need the floor plan of the facility that you're locked in. And the same goes for the economic captivity that our countries are trying to escape from.
You know, it's the deception that bothers me. The deception is cruel. I mean, from the moment they wrote the words, "We the people," leaders in the United States have relentlessly sought ways to subvert democracy in America. They've sought ways for outwitting their own founding documents for over 200 years. Even in the Constitution itself, you know, it provides for elections, and then it imposes mechanisms that render those elections pointless. The separation of powers, you know, the checks and balance system. Well, whose power is being checked? Elected power. The power of the elected representatives of the electorate. Nobody checks the Supreme Court, for example. That's really the supreme branch of the U.S. government, the Supreme Court. And those are lifetime positions. The framers of the Constitution seem to be primarily dedicated to creating a system that would ensure maximum inefficiency. Because the Founding Fathers were, as we know, deeply suspicious of government itself. I mean, think about it. No taxation without representation. That was the slogan. Well, that could go a different way. No representation, no taxation. If you asked Americans today, if you ask most Americans today, which would you rather have? Your whole paycheck or your senator? What do you think they would choose? Which do you think they would feel is more useful to them? Their full salary or their congressperson? Their congressperson who is completely subservient to his or her campaign donors and to whatever corporate sector they want to enter once they leave office. Their congressperson who listens and obeys lobbyists more than they'll ever listen to their constituents. I mean, the entire political platform for any candidate is calculatedly drafted to serve the interests of whatever business sector they're going to target for campaign funding. That's why they put the policies that they do, or the proposals that they do. Elections in the U.S. are like talent shows. Just like those shows where the audience votes for whoever sings the best, so that then they'll win a recording contract or something like that with a major producer. It's the same thing. You elect a politician, whoever sings the best, so that then that politician can win lucrative deals with business. It's got nothing to do with your interests. You pay a higher percentage of taxes, in fact, than corporations, but corporations have a higher degree of representation than you do. I mean, according to what's called the Citizens United decision, that was in 2010, corporations have personhood status under the law, except it's a super personhood status because they're larger than life. Corporations have the right to free speech under this ruling, and that speech includes political campaign funding. So literally money talks. The rule says that it would be an unfair restriction on corporations' right to freedom of speech to limit how much money they can spend to get whatever they want from politicians. Freedom and democracy. You see? They come up with every possible way to shut you out. And who do you suppose made that Citizens United decision? Well, it was the Supreme Court. I mean, look at education, at higher education in the United States. A functioning democracy requires an informed and educated public. That's what Thomas Jefferson said. He said that a well-informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny. So what can you deduce might be the objective when you make education prohibitively expensive? When you set up a system to restrict access to education for the citizenry and make it only accessible for the rich. Well, that's a recipe for tyranny, according to one of your own founding fathers, but that's what you're doing. I mean, my mother was still paying off her student loans when she was in her 70s. And you keep finding new ways to discourage people from going to university. It's not enough that you expect an 18 or 20-year-old to come up with more money than it takes to buy a house just to be able to get a degree. That's not enough. So you have to start creating useless degrees, useless so-called disciplines, degrees in electronic feminist activism, degrees in navel gazing, so that you can then start to say, well, university is really pointless. As if there aren't still degrees available in the sciences, in law, in business, in history, in the fundamental disciplines. You make people think that university is all just a joke. You set up all of these absurd degree programs to make university look like it's pointless. So why bother? Everyone thinks, just why bother? Why should I go into debt just to get a useless degree? Meanwhile, the children of the elite are still going to university because they're the ones who are on track to be the managers of society. They're on track to rule you. I mean, why do you think that they didn't allow slaves to learn to read in the South? The same reason that they don't want you to be educated. Because you're serfs. The U.S. is looking to revive domestic manufacturing. They want to bring back offshore factory jobs back to the U.S. They want you to be on an assembly line. They don't want you to have a lot of big ambitions about your future. They don't want you to have the intellectual tools for self-sufficiency or critical thought so that you can actually see and recognize and understand what your society really is. Everything about the society is calculated to marginalize the population. And one of the main instruments that they use to marginalize the population is the constant repetition about how free and how democratic it is. It's quite telling that for any other country in the world, if you want to learn about it, if you want to understand it, if you want to really know that society, you have to go there. You have to live there. You have to mix with the people. You have to experience it. But with America, it's different. People outside of the U.S. understand it and know it far better than Americans do. And if Americans want to actually learn about and understand their country, they would have to leave the U.S. They would have to go outside the U.S. to educate themselves about it. You would have to go outside of the U.S. to learn what America really is. Thomas Jefferson's defense against tyranny has been and is being systematically repressed in the United States. So you tell me what kind of a system that means it is. For security reasons, the government gets to watch you online. They get to know everything that you're doing. But for the same security reasons, you're not allowed to watch them online. You're not allowed to know what they're doing. All the CCTV cameras are pointed at you. All the surveillance systems are pointed at you. Meanwhile, your so-called public servants have more privacy than you do. What kind of a servant has more privacy and more rights than their supervisor? I mean, isn't that supposed to be the relationship? Politicians and bureaucrats, state workers, they're public servants, right? But can you monitor what Senator so-and-so is doing on the internet? Can you listen in when Congressman such and such meets with his donors, meets with his financiers, his funders, with businessmen? I mean, what's on Joe Biden's browser history? He can find out what's on yours. Why can't you know what's on his? And more importantly, the real power players are completely off the radar. The CEOs, the shareholders, the oligarchs, the people who have by far the most power over the conditions of everyday life for people in America and around the world, the people who have the most power over government policy, they're not even acknowledged as having that power. The real controllers of the society are completely obscured and unscrutinized and unaccountable, except to each other. That's the system. It just self-identifies as democratic.